Once a fortnight at Melbourne in Derbyshire, an elderly woman visits the graveyard where her granddaughter was buried. And from the back room of a terraced house, she spent 13 years lobbying people in authority.
Dear Mr. Newing, I do not know how much you know of the murder of my granddaughter Lynn Siddons, who was murdered April the 3rd, 1978, and my family and myself have been fighting to get the killer to justice.
Flo Siddons believes if she doesn't fight for justice, her granddaughter's death will be forgotten. The Brooks family was rehoused because with all the publicity, life in Sinfin had become unbearable. The council moved them to an address several miles away. But even there, Michael Brooks and his wife Dot were made to feel unwelcome. It had been that way since Lynn was murdered.
Roughly a week after Roy was, my stepson was arrested and charged with the crime. The little girl who was age 7, Tracy, she was beaten up. We had bricks thrown at the door, ominous letters. On one occasion, there was 3 lads aged about 11 to 12 that tried to strangle her. And through the good nature of the next door neighbour at that time, actually seeing this being taken place, and she chased the lads. Otherwise, I think my daughter had been dead.
Were you involved in the attack on Lynn Siddons?
No, I was not. No.
In any way?
No.
Lynn Siddons had entered the world unexpectedly. She was born in Derbyshire in England's East Midlands to 16-year-old Gail Siddons, who had been surprised by the pregnancy and terrified of telling her parents. But although Gail's father was angry, her mother Flo agreed to help raise the child. Lynn grew up calling her real mother by her first name, Gail, seeing her as an older sister, and referred to her grandmother Flo as her mum. At that time, none of them could have known that Lynn would leave the world as suddenly and unexpectedly as she had arrived. Despite the unconventional family situation, Lynn grew up to be a typical teenager. By this time, Gail had added 2 sons to the family, so the household was a busy and happy one. Lynn had a big record collection of songs from the 1950s and 60s, and she enjoyed going to her friend Catherine Weir's house for tea after school. They used to travel on the school bus together, and Catherine's dog Flash was the source of much laughter when he insisted on accompanying Lynn home from the Weir house every day. Each time Lynn went over to visit Catherine, she brought 3 biscuits, one for Catherine, one for herself, and one for Flash. On 3rd of April 1978, these innocent childhood rituals were abruptly cut short. The Siddons family grew concerned when 16-year-old Lynn failed to return from a shopping trip, and they knocked on all the neighbours' doors asking if anyone had seen her. At 10 p.m, Gail and Flo went to Derbyshire Constabulary and reported Lynn as a missing person. By now, it was cold, dark and windy, and the family were extremely worried for Lynn's safety. If she had got lost or was lying injured somewhere, she risked death from exposure to the elements. The police said it was too dark to start a search and reassured them that Lynn had probably run away and was sleeping rough somewhere. Gail sensed deep down that this wasn't the case, and she couldn't shake off the feeling that something terrible had happened to her daughter. Gail's 2 sons searched the local woods that night, but found nothing. A week passed, day by agonising day, with no news. Gail and Flo urged their local MP, Member of Parliament Philip Whitehead, to help them raise publicity about the missing teenager and to put pressure on the police to take action. Whitehead was adopted, which perhaps made him more acutely aware of the importance of family. He agreed with the Siddons' concerns that the police were failing to take the case seriously, and he pushed for a concentrated media campaign. Finally, 2 young men made a terrible discovery in some bushes near the Trent and Mersey Canal, just 1 mile from the Siddons family home. The body of a teenage girl who had been strangled, stabbed 43 times, and drowned in a puddle of water. Gail's fears had come true. The body was soon identified as missing 16-year-old Lynn Siddons. Shortly afterwards, a witness came forward to report seeing a 15-year-old mixed-race boy named Roy Brooks near the scene of the crime. Roy had been a friend of Lynn and lived just down the street from the family. He was promptly arrested and taken to the local police station, where he was questioned without a solicitor or a tape recorder, although his stepfather Michael Brooks was allowed to speak to him in private before he was interviewed. Roy claimed that he had stabbed Lynn after she made unwanted sexual advances towards him, but his story didn't fit with the evidence. He was only 4'10" and weighed just 6 stones, so it was hard to believe he could have committed the crime and then dragged the body into the bushes. Derbyshire police were quick to believe the story, a decision which would later come under intense scrutiny. Soon, Roy made a contradictory statement to his solicitor, implicating his stepfather, 6'2" labourer Michael Brooks. The police chose to disregard Roy's story, and they did not conduct a thorough search of the Brookses' home and garden, nor did they inquire into Michael Brooks's background. Had they done so, they might have unearthed some disturbing signs to make them think twice about whether they had the right person in custody. As a child, Michael Brooks had amused himself by throwing darts at knives at posters on his wall, and had once cut his hand while on a school trip, and sat completely enthralled as he watched blood dripping from the wound, making no attempt to call for help. He was fascinated by Jack the Ripper and had spoken candidly of his desire to outdo the killer and reach a higher victim count. But it was Michael's stepson Roy who entered the dock on 6th of November 1978 at Nottingham Crown Court to answer the charge of murder. His testimony was electrifying. The 15-year-old explained that his stepfather had given him a knife and commanded him to stab Lynn, but he had only cut her superficially. He explained that Michael had then continued the savage attack which had led to her death. His defence team pointed out that Lynn was taller and heavier than Roy, and that it was far more likely to have been his stepfather who delivered the fatal blows and dragged the body to its hiding place. It took just 1 hour for the jury to find Roy not guilty, and he was taken to a place of safety which transpired to be a psychiatric hospital. While under the hospital's care, Roy was interviewed again by Detective Superintendent Jim Reddington. His social worker was present throughout the questioning and later reported that he strongly felt the police were trying to encourage Roy to revert back to his original statement, the one which did not include his stepfather. Some of the officers involved in the case were beginning to wonder whether Michael had put pressure on his stepson when he had spoken to him in private at the police station after his arrest. The Siddons family were heartbroken and angry. Lynn had been snatched from them at the age of 16 with shocking violence, but they couldn't begin to seek closure and come to terms with their grief until they knew that justice had been done. They were unhappy with the way the police had handled the case from start to finish, and they staged a demonstration outside Derbyshire Police Station holding placards which read, "We want peace of mind," and Lynn's murderer must be found. The local community turned out in support of the family, and 6,000 signatures were gathered in a petition for the police to reopen the case and continue the stalled investigation. For many years their pleas fell on stony ground. The Brooks family moved a few miles away, but the local residents had heard about the case and didn't take kindly to them joining their neighbourhood. Roy's stepsister Tracy was attacked in the street, bricks were thrown at the family home, and Michael received anonymous threatening letters from outraged citizens who were convinced he was guilty of murdering the teenager. In 1980, Gail Siddons received a disturbing phone call from Michael's ex-wife Doris, from whom he had recently split. Doris told her that Michael had killed Lynn, and she even made a statement to the police to that effect, but retracted it when she and Michael reconciled sometime later. The Siddons family were furious. Feeling abandoned and unheard by the police, Lynn's aunt Cynthia drove her car at Doris and Michael when she saw them walking in the street and was fined for reckless driving. After this, the Brooks family relocated more than 75 miles southeast to start a new life in Peterborough, where they were far less likely to be recognised. By 1981, the police had given the Siddons family nothing but a series of disappointments, so they decided to contact Mirror journalist Paul Foote, who was known for his high-profile campaigns. They also filed a formal complaint against Derbyshire Police Force for failing to prosecute Michael Brooks. Senior police officials reviewed the complaint and were horrified. The independent report stated the quality of the investigation was unacceptable and recommended that a different police force reinvestigate the murder, but Derbyshire Police insisted there was insufficient evidence to prosecute and threw the report into the waste paper bin, unwilling to accept what they considered to be outside interference. The Siddons family were advised to let the matter drop. Even if they had been able to afford a top private prosecutor, it was highly unlikely that a conviction would be secured, as too much time had passed, and Derbyshire Constabulary was standing their ground. In the face of this advice, they steadfastly continued fighting for Lynn and refused to give up. Flo Siddons was granted financial aid in 1987 from the Law Society, which she used to fund an action for damages against Derbyshire Police. By this time, Derbyshire Police had appointed a new Chief Constable, John Newing, formerly of the Metropolitan Police. When Newing looked at the case, he agreed there was plenty of evidence that Michael Brooks should have been prosecuted, and he could not understand why this hadn't happened. He reassured the Siddons family that on his watch, the case was still very much open. But things still didn't move anywhere fast. Flo had been following Michael Brooks around for years and had even hired a metal detector and entered his garden, where she discovered a burnt knife and a charred pair of trousers, which she handed to the police for testing. Whether or not these items would have been admissible in court, having been obtained illegally by a member of the public, we will never know, as the police promptly lost them before they could be tested. Eventually, the Siddons family sued Brooks for murder through the civil courts, where he was tried by a judge but no jury, in the first case of its kind. Members of the press squeezed into the courtroom to hear Roy Brooks give evidence, eager to get the latest scoop to print in the national newspapers. It seemed the case was finally getting the widespread attention it deserved, having gone no further than the regional news for the last 13 years. Roy Brooks testified that his stepfather had urged him to lure Lynn to her death, as he had an insatiable desire to be like Jack the Ripper. Roy had never really believed he was serious, so when Michael started stabbing Lynn, he had realised with horror that his stepfather had meant every word. Michael Brooks did not attend the hearing. After weighing up the evidence, the judge was convinced that Michael Brooks was guilty of murder, but in the civil court system, all he had the power to do was order him to pay damages of £10,600. The civil case became the catalyst for Brooks to ultimately be tried in a criminal court, as it should have been from the outset, but this didn't happen until 18 years after the murder in 1996. Roy Brooks was the main witness for the prosecution and admitted to stabbing Lynn several times on the orders of his stepfather, but Michael had been the one to prolong the assault and end her life, immersing her head in a puddle of water before hiding the body. After a 6-week trial and 9 hours of deliberation, a jury found 51-year-old Michael Brooks guilty of the murder of Lynn Siddons. His defence lawyer argued that he had already served a sentence of sorts, having been forced to move 14 times in 18 years because of harassment from the victim's family and the media, which led him to spend his days watching TV at home alone to avoid the anxiety and panic attacks that going out in public induced, as he lived in fear of reprisals. He continued to proclaim his innocence even after he was sentenced to life in prison. Chief Constable Newing admitted that Derbyshire police were at fault for botching the investigation. When asked by a reporter,
"Are you saying basically that Derbyshire police made a mess of the case?"
he replied,
"You use emotive language, don't you? And I suppose that's inevitable. It's simple to put it, but bluntly, yes, I suppose that is, when you look back, that is the end result. Certainly that's how Flo Siddons sees it."
And you agree with that?
Yes.
He spoke with openness and honesty, exuding a sense of disappointment that the force had taken 2 decades to put the right man behind bars, having summarily ignored the concerns of the Siddons family and the new evidence they had presented. Journalist Paul Foote added respectfully,
"I think that Flo Siddons is one of the most remarkable women I've known. I met her first under the shadow of enormous tragedy. She brought Lynn up, and her murder and the horrific circumstances of it would have shaken any family. And they devastated Mrs. Siddons and her daughters, Gail and Cynthia, and the rest of her family. I think they were all deeply shaken by it. But to see that woman over the next 12 years enter her own old age, fighting for a cause, educating herself in the ways of the law, buttonholing journalists, appealing to MPs, going endlessly down to London, and simply doggedly saying one thing: the murderer of Lynn Siddons is still walking the streets a free man. The law should not allow that. He has to be brought to justice." And eventually people listened.
It had been a long and arduous battle, but thanks to the tenacity of Flo Siddons, who was 81 at the time of the trial, it was now over. She had been at the forefront of their campaign over the years, fighting with every ounce of her energy to seek justice for the granddaughter she had brought up as her own. Lynn had once been a startling new arrival to their family, but there was no question that she had captured their hearts as a baby and left footprints there that would remain forever, long after she was stolen from them at the age of just 16. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. This case was taken from my true crime book, Murder Casebook Volume 3. I know times are tough for a lot of us right now, but there are several ways you can support the show if you're able to. I'm proud that the podcast is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife from our spare bedroom, so any help is greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and consider leaving me a review wherever you get your podcasts, or share the show with a friend. Or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal to prashasmurdermap@gmail.com, or buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/prashasmurdermap. Alternatively, if you would like to contribute on an ongoing basis, you can do that through Patreon, so please feel free to check out the link in the show notes and see what rewards are on offer in return for your support. Thank you. I also have an audiobook available on Audible, Murder Casebook Volume 1, a collection of 12 shocking true crime cases narrated by British actor Mark Rice-Oxley, so please check that out if you're looking for a new audiobook. You can find all the links in the show notes. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandrand.com. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you again soon.